Good day. My name is Roger Berkowitz, and I'm the founder and academic director of the Hannah Arendt Center at Bard College, and I'm pleased to welcome you to today's virtual reading group. We're reading Hannah Arendt's last final book on revolution, and today we're discussing Chapter 1, the meaning of revolution. Well, it's an attempt on her part to say what the meaning of revolution is, and let me say that's an important formulation for Hannah Arendt. She's not an analytic philosopher. She's not going to give you the definition of revolution. She's not going to say if you have this, and this, you're going to get a revolution. The way Hannah Arendt writes and the way she thinks is to say, what's the significance? What's the meaning of this? And there's a reason for that within her entire body of work and thought, which is that she's interested for her to be human. To go back to when we read The Origins of Totalitarianism, when she talks about human rights, she says, to live and to be fed and to be housed is not to be human. To be human is to be able to act and speak in public in a way that matters. So what human life is not life like an animal, but meaningful life. And here, and again, in The Human Condition, she says, the book, The Human Condition, she says that what separates humans from other living beings is that we can create meaningful existences, that we can act and speak and do things in public that are remembered, and even more importantly, deserve to be remembered, and thus claim a kind of significance in the world and in immortality. And so when Hannah Arendt asks after the meaning of revolution, she's not asking for a simple definition. She's trying to understand why revolutions have suddenly become meaningful in the world. I say suddenly because prior to the French Revolution and the American Revolution, Arendt is suggesting that there weren't revolutions. There were wars, there were civil wars, there were foundings of states, but she thinks the revolutionary era begins in the late 18th century. And so to ask after the meaning of revolution is to ask after a specific political period, in an intellectual period, that has lasted from the 18th century up till the present. And as we talked about last week, discussing the preface to the book, she thinks that as wars become ever more destructive and potentially annihilatory, freedom becomes the only way to justify a war, and that makes it such that wars will slowly disappear and become ever closer to revolutions, and that revolutions will become ever more important in the modern era. And so in this chapter on the meaning of revolution, she tries to say, okay, why is it? What is it about revolutions that make them meaningful today? And not surprisingly, given what we've already learned, for her, there's a strong connection to freedom. And so freedom for her is two things. It's an idea, the idea of freedom, and it's going to be an experience. And as she says on page 19, crucial then to any understanding of revolutions in the modern age is that the idea of freedom and the experience of a new beginning should coincide. And so here we have two things that go together in our attempt to understand the meaning of revolution: the idea of freedom, and I would add to it the experience of freedom, which she'll talk about again later in this chapter and then much more later in the book, and then the experience of a new beginning. So we can even say three things: the idea of freedom, and then two experiences: the experience of freedom and the experience of a new beginning. People will say, well, is she really right historically? Are these things new, these ideas, this meaning of the revolution? And what she says is, there's been change throughout history. The Greeks understood change as sort of a constant change, the unalterable course of constant change in the universe, not a new break. And the Romans, really, their key words and key ideas was tradition, and thus a feeling of continuity, that which is carried over from the past. And the Christians, well, they certainly think of a new beginning, but the new beginning for Christians is transcendent and thus not in this world. And what she argues is that the modern revolutions are the first revolutions in which a new beginning really does emerge in this world. You know, I don't know how many. I hope some of you have watched the video I made. I went through much of this in the second section of this chapter, which is really the core section where she develops her ideas of the idea of freedom, the experience of freedom, and the experience of a new beginning. And we can come back to it. Let me just highlight for us a couple of quick things. The first is that she says that for the Greeks, freedom was necessarily a political phenomenon. It came out of this world of isonomy, which is a law of equality. But it's a law of equality that for her was not meaning we're all the same in a natural sense, but we're all the same politically. And so the idea that we're all the same politically means that we all can act and speak in a way that we are taken seriously, that we have meaning, and thus we are free. And so freedom for her is not possible without this isonomy, without a kind of equality of appearing in public, which goes back to our claim in about the origins of totalitarianism, that the truly human right, the right to have rights, as she expresses it, is the right to speak and act in a meaningful way in a political community. And what this means, and we talked about this last time, but I just want to repeat it, is that freedom is not the same as liberation. And here on pages 22 to 24, she makes this clear. She says liberation is simply freedom from constraint, which is a condition for freedom, but is not freedom. Freedom is more. It's more than just being free from constraint. It's something else. And she says on page 24, freedom includes, quote, speech making and decision taking, the oratory and the business, the thinking and the persuading, and the actual doing, which proved necessary to drive this claim to its logical conclusion, independent government and the foundation of a new body politic. Freedom is not just absence from constraint, it's doing, speech-making, decision-taking, oratory, business, thinking, persuading. It's acting and speaking in the presence of others so that we matter. And that's the meaning of freedom. And that revolutions are that. They're the pursuit of being able to do that. And so the key to revolution is not making the poor rich, it's making the invisible visible. And that for her, so she at one point in the text, she talks about how the mistake that people made, that John F. Kennedy made in understanding the Cuban Missile Crisis and the Cuban Revolution, is they thought it was about poverty. She says it wasn't about poverty. Like all revolutions, it's about visibility, about recognition. And thus they didn't understand the power of the Cuban Revolution and how hard it would be to oppose it. The experience of this new beginning, which is the second part of it, was that somehow the people, the revolutionaries, both in France and the United States, didn't set out to say, we want to do something new, right? So, we've all, I'm sure, somewhat aware of the claim that the new culture of Silicon Valley and the new culture is the love of the new, the need for the novel. That wasn't what drove the revolutionaries. They actually wanted to go back. They wanted to restore freedoms that they thought had been lost. But in the fight for freedoms, as that fight became violent, as that fight became, really hit its crucial moments, they began to do something, act, fight, struggle in public and matter. And that experience of acting and fighting and mattering, which was driven by an idea of freedom, now became an experience of freedom and began to be an experience of something new. And as she says on page 24, this relatively new experience new to those at any rate who made it was at the same time the experience of man's faculty to begin something new. And this led to their changing course and not seeking simply to restore freedom, but to actually build a revolution. Chapter 3 is an attempt to talk about Machiavelli as the great precursor of revolutions. I talked a bit about that in the video. We can come back to it if you want. Chapter 4 is on this idea of the revolutionary spirit and how it is really something that didn't set out to be novel, but is something new. And then section 5 of this chapter on the irresistibility of freedom. I just want to talk about the last couple pages, in which he discusses the Russian Revolution, the October Revolution, which I didn't talk about in the video. As I'm sure some of you know, this is the 100th anniversary of the October Revolution. And there's a ton of new writings about revolution coming out. I'm going to be speaking a couple times on it, and one of the questions that always comes up is why did Arendt ignore the Russian Revolution? Right? She sort of talks about it very, very briefly in this text. The other revolution that people accuse her of ignoring is the Haitian Revolution. And she ignores them both for largely the same reason. She thinks that both the Haitian Revolution and the Russian Revolution were largely derivative of the French Revolution. They spoke in the same language, they acted the same way. The head, the Toulouse, I forget his name, but the man who helped lead the Haitian Revolution was parroting Rousseau and Robespierre. He was very brilliant but really very much in the spirit of Robespierre. And similarly for the October Revolution. So on pages 47 to 49, where she talks about this at the end of this chapter, she writes that the magic spell which historical necessity has cast over the minds of men since the beginning of the 19th century gained in potency by the October Revolution, which for our century has had the same profound meaningfulness of first crystallizing the best men's hopes and then realizing the full measure of their despair that the French Revolution had for its contemporaries. So in our century, the October Revolution was the great attempt of raising our hopes and then dashing them. Except this time it was not unexpected experiences which hammered the lesson home, but a conscious modeling of a course of action upon the experiences of a bygone age and event. So she's saying that the October Revolution consciously modeled itself on the French Revolution, even to the point where it modeled itself on the need for an ideology and for terror, and knew, as she says on the top of 48, that the revolution had to involve terror in order to do what it wanted to do, which is overthrow and create a new kind of person that could live in this new ideological world. And what it learned, therefore, was not freedom and not action, but history, the necessity of history. And she here is criticizing Marx and Hegel for their historical and scientific historical approach to politics, which takes away the experience of the new and the free, and thus makes revolutions unrevolutionary. They're not. They don't either involve the experience of freedom or the experience of the new. Okay, I'm going to stop there, and we'll see where we end up. Good. I see a long comment from Bob Meyerson. Let me read it and see if I can make sense of it. He writes, our Hannah Arendt Center group is more oriented to political philosophy than it is to history. Good. But don't philosophical claims have to answer to historical record, where philosophy translates? That's an interesting and important question, and the answer is yes, although at times the philosophical attempt simplifies history, and very much Arendt's sort of critique of Marx and Hegel. And obviously there are people who are criticize her for that as well. Arendt asserts that the American Revolution was a great success because it wasn't burdened by or required to come to terms with the social question. Right, that's the next chapter. In light of American slavery, does her claim that the American Revolution established a new secular order which carved out a realm of freedom stand up? If the answer is that it enabled the eventual abolition of slavery, what about slavery's legacy, the millions of underclass, welfare-dependent African Americans with education, jobs, or hope who remain left behind? Why wouldn't Arendt see the bloodless, glorious revolution of 1689 in Great Britain as another model of a successful revolution? She does not mention it. True, the goal of the glorious revolution was to restore the rights of Parliament while saving Great Britain from what many believed the oppression of popery. But it was successful in achieving its goals without the same time devolving into civil war as did our American Revolution in its treatment of its Tories. Okay. Bob, as always, there's a lot there. So let me say a couple preliminaries and then get to the core. First of all, we're going to talk about this a lot next week or in 2 weeks when we next meet, when we discuss the chapter on the social question and read what Hannah Arendt says about slavery there. So we're going to come back to this, which doesn't mean we can't address it now, but just I'm putting that out there. On the glorious revolution, Arendt doesn't include it within the context of revolutions because she doesn't consider it to be a revolution driven by the experience of freedom and the idea of freedom. It was an attempt to restore a kind of equilibrium, a kind of power of the Parliament over and against the king and the Pope. But it was not, in her mind, and I think she's right on this, an attempt to bring an entire new class of people out of the shadows and into the political realm of visibility. And so it wasn't driven by what she calls freedom, the desire to appear in public and become meaningful by an entire new class of people. So happy to come back to that if it becomes an issue. So on the question of the success or failure of the American Revolution, I think this is one of the really unresolved questions when people read this book and talk about it. There are many people like Bob, or as Bob is suggesting here, who say, Arendt's entire thesis seems to be disproved by the fact of slavery. Okay, so one way to say, well, she ignores slavery, except she doesn't to the extent she talks about it, and she says some very sharp things about it. And what she says is, on the one hand, it's the great crime that has defined the American experiment, and she says it's the one thing that may make the American experiment fail. So because it was the great crime and it was the great thing that we ignored, the American revolutionaries ignored, it may lead to the failure of the American Revolution. She talks about how the American Revolution succeeded in establishing freedom. And she says, but it did so with one great caveat, which it is that it ignored the slaves. And it did so because the slaves were so dehumanized that they could be ignored. And on the one hand, she says, this was a dehumanization, and this is clearly the great crime of the American Revolution, and thus a great tragedy. And here's where she sometimes gets into trouble with people. At the same point, she says, it was the great fortune of the American Revolution that they ignored the slaves. Because if they hadn't, the revolution would have turned towards the social question, potentially, of trying to bring the slaves into a kind of equality, social equality, and in doing so, would potentially have turned away from their laser-like focus on freedom and sought a more socially oriented outcome of the revolution. So there's some people who say, how could she say it was lucky that they ignored slavery? And I think we'll have to talk about that. She's certainly not saying it was right that they did so. She says it was the great crime. And she says it's what made tear down the republic. But what it did is it allowed the revolution to focus really, I mean, laser-like is maybe, I'm going to use a cliche, but to really focus on one thing, which is creating a free political system in which all the people who were visible actually could participate and engage in the public sphere and appear. And because America had two things: one, the slaves were invisible and thus ignored, and two, while it had poverty, it didn't have misery for the most part, such that even the poor people still could participate and still had a voice and still had a sense of being a public person and certain dignity. It could actually get on with the question of just saying, okay, how do these free people govern themselves, rather than worrying about the question of inequality. And that's her approach. So yes, she says that it succeeded for a time in founding free institutions, but it did so at the cost of ignoring and excluding the slave population, and in doing so, potentially brought about its failure. Right? That's the argument. Yeah. I'm not sure I can say much more right now. We'll read when we read the social question chapter. We'll have the text in front of us and we can say more about it. So, I think more than arguing a thesis about its success, I guess what I would say, Bob, is that she's saying it was successful in the sense that it established free institutions for the first time in the history of the world. Free institutions in the sense that all the citizens who were free became self-legislating, self-governing, part of the self-government of the people. That had never happened before. At least it hadn't happened in a long time, and not to the extent that it had ever in the United States. But it did so on actually not just one exclusion. We can say three exclusions, which she mentions. One is the Indians. Two was women. And three is the slaves. I think the question is, can you bring Indians, Native Americans, women, and former slaves into that system, or is the system set up to exclude them? Right? We've talked about that in the past as the question of whether the creed can encompass this change. Bob, do you want to respond in some way to that? Or
yeah, I'm a bit of a provocateur, so I'm not saying that's necessarily my position. But before you joined the led the discussion, I mentioned that Ta-Nehisi Coates had an interesting question, or article in the current Atlantic called "The First White President," which bears on this. And essentially, his is a critique of Mark Lilla's critique of identity politics. So Coates is bringing the social question back in a legitimate but somewhat telescoped way, and he's not suggesting, well, at least not in this article, that somehow there isn't a foundation, such as Arendt was describing, upon which we can draw or refer back to. But he was criticizing the white working class as being racist. And his suggestion almost seems to be it's racist now, it was racist then when indentured servants were let off the hook and slavery came into the country. So I think it's very relevant to our discussion, wondering if for next time you can provide us with Lilla and Coates's discussion, or maybe we want to just stick to the text.
That's a good question for the group, and I'm happy to hear people's thoughts. I mean, we've sort of run a slightly interesting obstacle course as we've gone through the last 2 or 3 years on this group, where we've read the text, but you've allowed me to bring in other people who are in the news at any given time, and some of you have brought them up and comment on them in relation to the text. If people would like to read the Coates article, or I don't want to read the whole Lilla book, but you could even read the Lilla article that the book was based on. We could do that in addition. Yeah, I think we've touched on this at times in this group, but there's a question of what racism is that Hannah Arendt has a very strong view on, which again is provocative. I mean, like Bob, she's a bit of a provocateur, but in a sense that she actually is making unconventional arguments based in principle, but that are often quite outside the mainstream. There's a debate right now, I think, going on around the world about what racism is. There's an old definition of racism, which is that racism is on either a biological or cultural, an identification of a biological or cultural or ethnic group with kind of set characteristics in which that group is considered to be inferior or superior based on these kind of racial characteristics. And thus, racism is a justification for exclusion or violence. That's the classic definition of racism. It has emerged in the mid to late 20th century. There's new definitions of racism which are much broader, which say that racism is any kind of institutional or other advantages, even if they're not accompanied by a kind of feeling of superiority or inferiority, even if they're not accompanied by a sense of biological or even cultural connected of a race. There's another view of racism that it's simply any time someone is privileged or underprivileged in any way, intentional or not, because of their race. And there's others too. I don't want to go into a whole course on racism, although it's something I'm very interested in. And these are and so part of the issue is that when people say X is racist or the white working class is racist, one of the problems we have is that all three of those and more ideas of racism are suddenly brought to the fore, and one has a problem in and if you try and analytically say, okay, which one, often you get branded as someone who's willing to make fine distinctions where one should make them, right? And we can, that's a different discussion. But I'm of the opinion that it actually matters what we mean by racism if we're going to have a conversation about racism, and that these are not all the same things. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of texts in which Arendt talks a lot about racism. This isn't particularly one of them, but it's something I'd love to have we could have a discussion about in some way. Let me move on for now, and if we want to come back to this in questions, I'm happy to do that. Is that all right, Bob? Yeah, I mean, and let me say, if people want to read,
yes,
people want to read the Lilla or the Coates essay, put it in the comments or let us know at arendt@bar.edu, and we can send it out, and we can include it in our conversation next week. I'm happy to do that. Thank you that Toussaint was the leader of the Haitian Revolution. Thanks, Johanna. Rukaya writes, if I'm not mistaken, I've read that Hannah Arendt believed that ancient Greeks shaped our thinking, how we view the world, how we interpret phenomena, and how we view freedom, etc. The ancient Greeks' conception of equality in terms of freedom is what Arendt favored in the American Revolution, ? That everyone's opinion mattered, pursuit of happiness, there was a sense of I instead of we in the case of the French Revolution. So it's a good question, Rakaya. There's numerous historical sources that Arendt makes use of, just like there's many philosophical sources she makes use of. And there's one reading of Arendt, which largely is driven by readings of her book, The Human Condition, in which people say she's sort of very much influenced by the Greeks and is even romantic for the Greeks and the Greek polis. I think that's a misreading of her and of even The Human Condition. Arendt, uses the Greeks, she uses the Romans. In a number of her texts, the Romans are privileged explicitly over the Greeks and say the Greeks were wrong, the Greeks didn't get it, and the Romans had it much better. And so, I think this idea of her as being a Greek, a philo Greek is a bit overstated. In the case here, her citation of Herodotus and the idea of isonomy is not said to be in any kind of sense determinative. It's an example for what she means freedom to be. Freedom for her is about equality in public, and in this case, she thinks the Greeks understood that, and the Greeks provide a model for that. She's not trying to say that there's a line between us and the Greeks. She's not trying to say we should go back to the Greek idea of isonomy. In fact, that's exactly not what she's trying to say. She's trying to say that the Greeks had an idea of freedom. It's one that has lasted in many ways and is part of our tradition of freedom. And she thinks it's the tradition of freedom that the revolutionary tradition in France and America, and here she's talking about both France and America, really aimed after, that these revolutionaries, both in France and America, as they started to engage in the revolution, became enamored with this idea of being in public. And they began to see the revolution not just as an end to be achieved, but as a new way of being political, a new way of being human, and that's what she's after here. And so the reference to isonomy, is to say this idea of freedom is not in itself new, and yet its embrace in the revolutions, the modern revolutions, is new. I take it she's really trying to make a point to make us aware of what she means by freedom. Freedom as appearing in public as equal. And so does that mean she's philo-Greek? In this case, she's definitely influenced by the Greeks in her idea of freedom. But there's many other cases in which she would prefer the Romans or even the Christians at times in her thinking. So I don't think it's helpful to see her as always a nostalgic for the Greek way of the polis. Okay. What about the revolution in China in the 20th century? It's a good question, Larry. She writes a lot about the Soviet Revolution because she writes her book, The Origins of Totalitarianism, which comes out in 1950. She therefore developed a lot of her thinking on the Russian Revolution at that time, she didn't know nearly as much about the Chinese Revolution. She also didn't, not only didn't read Chinese, but I don't think there was as much written about it in English, German, and French, which were her three main languages. And so she didn't pay as much attention to it. She did, in a series of letters, address the Chinese Revolution, and began to, but more not in the question of revolution, and rather instead in the question of totalitarianism, arguing that actually Mao was a totalitarian, or was more totalitarian than someone like Khrushchev was, and that in a sense the Russians had become less totalitarian, and the Chinese were were more totalitarian at that point. I don't know of her any of her texts addressing the question of the Chinese Revolution as a revolution. I imagine if she were to do so, she would have similar critiques, that it was based in the social question and not around the question of freedom, which clearly it didn't aim for in any meaningful sense. So, but I don't really know much more about that. My colleague, who I've been writing a book with, Peter Baer, who's based in Hong Kong, colleague in the collegial sense, has written an essay on Arendt and the Chinese Revolution, Arendt and Mao. And if you're interested, I would highly recommend looking that up. He's actually, because he lives in Hong Kong, very interested in China and done a fair bit of research on it, and often written about China with an Arendtian angle. So if you're interested in that, he would be the person to look for. Johanna writes, revolution so often fails. I'm thinking about the so-called revolutions of the 60s. The social revolutions did not lead to freedom in the long term because so many of the revolutions turned conservative and rather supported the same policies that precipitated the revolution in the first place. What would she think about this? Well, I think she would agree with you. And I talked a little bit about that last class, but let me repeat it. I've mentioned a couple times in our discussions an idea that she talks about called a revolutionary situation, right? For her, a revolutionary situation is when the power in a particular community, political community, has dissipated. And when there's a sense of that the authorities no longer have authority, that even they barely have power. And there's an opportunity that if another group were to organize and act collectively, they could potentially take over, right? In the 60s, between the anti-war movement and the civil rights movement, there was clearly in her mind, as she writes, a situation of a breakdown of power. And as she says, power was lying in the streets, ready to be picked up. But, as she writes again, in most instances where power is lying in the streets, waiting to be picked up, it won't be. And this is, I think, Johanna's question, why not? And her answer is because the people who try and pick it up, the so-called, as she calls them, so-called revolutionaries, don't actually haven't actually analyzed the contemporary situation in such a way that they can articulate a vision, articulate an idea that would give them power, that would create a public support for their views. They too often, she says, rely on old cliches, socialism, third worldism, or a kind of conservative restoration of order, which she thinks are not feasible and not in any way able to articulate a common sense for the country. And the result is that they are able to cause trouble because power is dissipated in the country, but they're not able to form a new common sense behind which they could take power. And so the main problem with these so-called revolutionaries is that they don't have a thought out program or idea that would unite a plurality or a majority of their country. You want to follow up, Johanna, or is that, or because I mean, we talked about that before last class, but I'm happy to say more about it. You want to add something, or I move on? Jennifer, does anyone want to add something to that, or are we good? Jennifer writes, I think the revolutions of the 60s succeeded. Civil rights and women's liberation changed the landscape. We became visible. So I think in many ways that's the case, that the movements succeeded. Whether they were revolutions is an interesting question. They, and this comes back to Bob's first question, I think, in many ways. What the civil rights and the feminist revolutions did is open the institutions of freedom of the American Revolution to new groups of people. And in doing so, made new groups of people visible and gave them access to politics and power. Arendt would not call that a revolution per se, because it wasn't creating a new system. There was not a new system involved. I mean, maybe it's a semantic question, and we could say that those revolutions were revolutions because people involved in the revolutions experienced freedom and experienced something new power. Except it really was more a desire to be included in the current system rather than overturning and founding of a new system. Again, unless you want to make the argument that by including women and African Americans and others in that system, you actually change the system. And if so, we'd have to have that argument. I mean, in many ways, there's been a different kind of revolution in the country, or as Arendt would put it, corruption of the American institutions of freedom, insofar as we have become such a big and bureaucratic country, as she writes in many places. Bureaucracy, not in the sense of simply administration, but bureaucracy in the sense of increasingly the people responsible for governing the country are not democratically elected or democratically responsible or responsive, because they're in administrative agencies and appointed and immune to the democratic system. That the idea of Americans being present and powerful and active self-governors has largely dissipated. And that certainly is part of her argument. Larry writes, it is helpful to include participation in the definition of freedom rather than adding participation to freedom as a formula. Yes, I think that's right. I mean, freedom for her includes, now that's what you say, include participation, includes the acting and speaking, or at least the right to act and speak in public in ways that matter. It includes speech making and decision taking, oratory, and the business. This is back on 24. I take that to mean it includes participation in the sense you're saying, Larry. Okay. Suzanne writes, since we are creating a list of possible revolutions, I would like to add the possibility of usefully thinking about Steve Bannon as a revolutionary. He certainly is calling for a kind of terror and a new beginning. There's a lot of language of revolutions these days. Bernie Sanders called for a revolution, and also Trump at times called for a revolution. I think it's important for us to sort of look at why revolutionary language is so vivid today and so apparent. And I think there's a number of reasons. One is that on the left and the right, which is not to equate the left or the right, there is a sense that the legitimacy and authority of the establishment and its power are delegitimate and have largely disappeared. One of the, I think I mentioned, did I mention this last class? There's an article recently, I don't remember where it was, maybe one of you can remind me, that said that one of the reasons that Trump won was that his supporters have come to have zero faith that politicians can get anything done, and thought that a business person, that business is where the power is in the country, and that a business person might actually be able to get something done. I'm not endorsing the argument or thinking that it's a good argument, but I think it reflects an overarching belief that many on the left and many on the right have, that government is broken, and that the sort of legitimacy of government is at a low point and has even become illegitimate. I mean, Occupy Wall Street was, to me, very much an expression of that view. So, as for Bannon, yeah, I mean, I think he wants some significant changes. His argument is that the Republican Party has ceased to be a reflection of the people, and it has become a reflection of business and intellectual elites, as has the Democratic Party for him, and that a revolutionary political party, something like the Tea Party, has to bring the voices of everyday Americans back into politics. Again, whether this is actually a revolution or not is an interesting question. I don't think it is, but I think it's certainly it could become one. Let's put it that way. Like the American Revolution, it begins not as a revolution, but as an argument to restore past liberties. But one of the things that's really happened in the Tea Party, and I think it's now happening somewhat in the resist movement, and that came out of the Occupy movement, is that the people who act in them and engage in them start to really love the experience of acting politically. And this is the experience of freedom and the experience of a new beginning that Arendt talks about. And that kind of experience could lead to a revolution, but really only will if it's able to appeal to a wide range of the American population. And currently that's simply not the case, right? And neither the Bannon wing of the Trump, the Bannon wing of the country, nor the Occupy Wall Street sort of far left Bernie wing of the country, can appeal to even something like a plurality of the country, as far as I can tell, which is why neither is being successful in bringing its revolution to fruition. Given what we are witnessing now through the many phenomena of social media, do we need a significant recasting of what Arendt means by being in public and its meaningfulness? I don't think so. I think one of the things we're seeing is the failure of social media to provide a meaningful public presence. And and to go on with what I just said, one of the problems is that what social media does is it encourages people to signal themselves as members of a team or a tribe on one side, and they speak just to that tribe. Because the more you speak to an already existing tribe, the more popular you are in that world. But you then turn off or are ignored by all the people who are in another tribe or who aren't a member of any tribe. And so, in fact, what social media is doing is creating little mini publics that are really not, in any, I think, meaningful sense, uh, um, uh, able to establish a new public realm. So you can be in public in these small mini things, but it's largely speaking to the choir, right? And that's what social media is encouraging, as far as I understand it. It's one of the dangers of social media today, and it's again one of the reasons social media is, I think, so damaging to our politics. Jennifer writes, when you discussed freedom as being the right to speak and act in a meaningful way in public, I can't help but think of the current turmoil in Berkeley with the speech of Ben Shapiro and the protests. Although the protests were peaceful, I saw it as a struggle for the protesters. They didn't want Shapiro to speak in public. They didn't, and I think two things happened this week, right? We can compare them, right? So on the one hand, those of you who don't know, Ben Shapiro, who's he's a conservative. I don't know how else to put it. He's a conservative. I should say he's a never Trumper, which means he's from the very beginning. He's one of the first people who, on the conservative side, came out against Trump. And he's also a former Breitbart reporter who left Breitbart and has called the alt-right racist and anti-Semitic, and has been at the forefront of criticizing the alt-right. But he's nevertheless a conservative. And he was invited to Berkeley, and his speech went on yesterday at the cost to Berkeley of $600,000. I think it's important to take that number and think about it for a second. I mean, that's like almost the entire yearly budget of Bard College, or at least almost over half that yearly budget of Bard College. To have one speech by a guy who's anti-Trump and anti-alt-right cost the University of California, Berkeley, $600,000 in police protection. On the other side, some of you may know that Chelsea Manning was supposed to speak at Harvard recently. She's supposed to be a fellow at Harvard's Kennedy School. And two members of the CIA, including the head of the CIA, withdrew their participation in talks and said they would not talk at the Kennedy School because the Kennedy School was inviting Chelsea Manning. For those who don't recall, Chelsea Manning was the person who leaked to WikiLeaks documents about U.S. operations and torture in Syria and the Middle East, and then while in prison, underwent a transition to being a woman, and was eventually released after 8 years in prison, even though she was, I think, sentenced to 28 years, if I have it right. So you have two on opposite sides of the country. On the one hand, a liberal, for better or worse, a liberal speaker, Chelsea Manning, who's a trans individual, being stripped of her right to speak or her fellowship at Harvard. And on the other side of the country, after Milo Yiannopoulos and the woman Ann Coulter were canceled in their speeches at Berkeley, Carol Christ, the chancellor of Berkeley, I think to her credit, has said Berkeley is going to stand up and hold itself to principles of free speech and the free speech movement that began at Berkeley. And she spent $600,000 to allow Ben Shapiro to speak. I think both of these individuals, Chelsea Manning and Ben Shapiro, are perfectly legitimate speakers. I think they're both people who have something to offer to the public sphere and should be heard. But the problem is that it's almost impossible for colleges these days to hear them, because you either have to pay $600,000 or you have to have the CIA say, we're not going to send people there. Now, a lot of people would say, who cares? But for the Kennedy School, they need the CIA. I mean, that's sort of their bread and butter, better or worse. And so, these are important questions for thinking about the public sphere and colleges. I know there was a recent article written by two people. I haven't had a chance to look at it closely, arguing that a lot of this stuff about free speech and plurality on campus is overblown, and that for the most part, campuses are pretty plural places. I think campuses are more pluralistic than people often think. There are a lot more different views on campuses than are presented, but there's no doubt that at least on certain campuses, a kind of sense of what is allowed and what is not allowed to be said in public has emerged, and I think that's, to me, uncontroversial. And by the way, it's on both sides. So on the one hand, you can't have someone like Ben Shapiro, or it's very difficult, and it's also very difficult to have someone like Chelsea Manning. And I think that on both cases, that's a mistake, and it's sad. Bob writes, I agree with Suzanne. Let's remember what Suzanne says, that we're creating Steve Bannon's revolutionary. And that is why Bannon is such a threat to our democracy, the more so, as Roger suggests, that Arendt's conception of the American Revolution is not a finished product, but is a vulnerable project. Arendt has a tendency to telescope, that is, to focus on her subject to the exclusion of possible potential counter examples. This made her especially vulnerable to criticism in Eichmann in Jerusalem. I think that's fair, and I think that I think we're at a very particularly vulnerable situation in the United States right now, because I think the mainstream institutions of power are so illegitimate. I mean, I don't know what the exact numbers are, but the legitimacy of Congress is down to single digits or low double digits. The president is at the lowest popularity rating in history at this time. But it's not just them. Universities. I mean, I'm sure some of you know that, especially among Republicans, the feeling that universities are important and universities are doing a good job has sunk to extremely low numbers. So we're at a very vulnerable position. And I think that somehow, some way, in an Arendtian way, we need some person or some group or some idea to emerge that will reinvigorate an American renaissance in a certain way. But that's a tall order. And right now, I don't see anyone in public life who is successful at appealing to a wider range of voices that could actually sustain such a new coalition or new idea. And that's what we need. I think that's what Arendt's understanding of the kind of politics that we need right now is. Someone who, without the ideology of the left and without the ideology of the right, looked at the real situation and tried to speak honestly about it in a way that could carry people from all the different sides. But that is somewhat incumbent upon people from the different sides being ready to embrace someone who would require them to compromise in some way. And right now, compromise is a bad word. Basically, I think right now, anyone who tries to think like we're doing in this group is seen as politically suspect. I don't know how you guys feel about that. I don't know if you feel politically suspect, but I increasingly feel that anyone who doesn't commit to being always left or always right finds themselves somewhat left out of the conversation on Facebook or Twitter or whatever, and always sort of on the verge of being seen as a traitor to their cause. You sort of have to be on the team first and that makes it very difficult for the teams to somehow compromise or meet in the middle. I'd be interested to know if people feel that is a meaningful expression of our current experience. Kim writes, did she write anything about the Cuban Revolution? That's an excellent question. She didn't, as far as I know, write much about it, although if you turn to the very first page of your book here, the acknowledgments before the table of contents, at least in my edition, you'll see that the topic of this book was suggested to me by a seminar on the United States and the Revolutionary Spirit held at Princeton University in the spring of 1959 under the auspices of the Special Program in American Civilization. Interesting, right? Who's funding things? For the completion of the work, I'm indebted to the Rockefeller Foundation. So one of the things that's interesting is that at that 1959 seminar at Princeton, there was a speech that year by Fidel Castro. And while we don't know for sure, we assume that Arendt attended it. And Castro, in the speech, actually, compares the Cuban Revolution to the American Revolution in ways that are actually quite interesting. And so it's just an interesting historical thought that in the seminar that led Arendt to think about this book and thus to write the book, Castro was a voice in the room. So I don't know much more than that. Manning will give a lecture, but not a fellow. Right. Oh, I didn't know that. Okay. So she's still going to speak, but they've stripped her of her fellowship. That I didn't read that when I first read it, so it's good to know. I at least think that's better than not letting her speak. But as we go forward, so I mean, at that point, I'm not totally opposed to that as a thing. I mean, if you don't support Manning, you don't have to give her a fellowship, but I think you should let her speak, especially after you've invited her. At least that's my view. Lukaya says, I feel that way too. I take that to be a reference to this question of it's very hard to try and have nuance in these conversations. I know, this is just my own view, is I feel constantly like people feel I'm letting the team down, if that makes any sense. And I think it's become very hard. And that leads to a kind of self-censorship. There's no doubt about it. And I mean, I'm struggling and forcing myself not to censor myself as much as I can, but there's no doubt that there's a kind of self-censorship going on around the colleges and universities, at least in the world I hang out in. And I know many people feel it because a lot of people who feel it come and talk to me about it. And I think that it's a widespread phenomenon right now. Now, let me say, I think there are many places in the country where people on the left have to self-censor them because there's a right-wing common sense. And I think that's not necessarily new. But I think that social media, and not just social media, but the publicness of all of our utterances is now quite dangerous. I mean, I was having dinner last night with someone who said, there's a lot of things that it's perfectly acceptable to say to your friend that you don't want to put on Twitter or put on Facebook. But now, not only do people say those things on Facebook and Twitter, you have to worry that anytime you say or do anything, someone else will put it on Facebook or Twitter. And so everything we do is suddenly potentially a public statement, and that can't but make us more careful in the way what we're willing to say and do, because it may become very public. Jennifer writes, political suspicion emerges if one doesn't agree with ideology, in my opinion. If one doesn't agree with another person's ideology, then we're suspicious of them. I take that to be what you're meaning, Jennifer, and I think you're right. Part of the problem is that our public life has become so ideological that it has lost its ability to transcend ideology. Kim writes, I do too. I live in Berkeley, where one does have to be pretty much in lockstep politically. No surprise to anyone, I'm sure. Yeah, I mean, I wonder, Kim, on the other hand, they did invite Ben Shapiro yesterday. I don't know if did you try and go to the talk? Did you know anyone who went to the talk, or was it considered to be, if you went to the talk, you were suspect? I don't know what you think. Do you want to say anything about the situation around the talk in Berkeley, Kim?
I didn't go to the talk, but I do know that just talking to people in Berkeley, if you do kind of show any nuance, if you like, the conversation kind of shuts down, or you're kind of condemned for any thought that wavers from kind of the liberal, standpoint. It's very hard to have any conversation, and just listening to conversations in coffee shops, people are vehement and are not willing to listen to any other point of view.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, I think there's different communities around the country, and there's some communities where they're not willing to listen to anything but an alt-right point of view, and some communities where they're not willing to listen to anything but a black nationalist point of view or another point of view. I mean, the kind of suspicion we're leading to is very problematic. I mean, the students at Bard have now invited a black nationalist speaker to come, a man named Umar Johnson, that the Arendt Center is sponsoring as his talk. But we're starting to get some pushback because it turns out that he has said often and defended and argued that what he calls the gay and transgender lifestyle agenda is an attack on black maleness and black families. He's been very clear that he's not anti-gay or anti-transgender, and that he has a philosophy of love and says that all people should have all the rights, and that this is not at all an issue of rights or even hate. He says he doesn't preach any kind of hate, but he does think that the government shouldn't be forcing children to learn about these lifestyles because he thinks it's hurting black families. It's a popular opinion in many communities. It's obviously deeply hurtful to people who are gay or transgender. I think obviously it does. I don't think it's obviously hurtful, but it is hurtful to many. And these are the kind of questions that suddenly someone who represents a viewpoint that is really talking about what it means to have a strong black family and strong black communities, and how to support black men who are in crisis, and the prison population in this country is unbelievable. It's a conversation we need to have. Here's one of the voices that is really resonating deeply, and people want to exclude him because of his view of transgender and gay students. Again, I think we have to have principled understandings of why we bring people and who we won't bring. And I think someone who would come out and say we hate gay people, we hate blacks, we hate women, whatever, hate Jews, to me, you don't bring them unless there's an absolute reason to bring them in some context. I would not invite them to a lecture in general. But someone who's engaged in a conversation about black masculinity and the crisis of black masculinity, who has some controversial views, to me, that's a conversation worth having. And so I've tried to lay out a principled position on that ground. And obviously people can disagree with it, but at least I'm trying to think it through on this principled position. Johanna writes, it is increasingly more difficult. When I read that, Johanna, I hope you don't mind. I always think of Hannah Arendt because her name was Johanna Arendt in Germany, but it is shortened.
My name is also.
You're named after her? You said, Lisa?
Not after her, but I'm from Germany, and it is Johanna.
Yeah. Okay, Johanna. Yeah.
Thank
So
you.
I always, whenever you write, I'm always thinking of Hannah. Johanna. It is increasingly more difficult to be reasoned and objective, and sadly, even at university where I teach, politics is not an approachable topic of conversation. Can I ask where you teach, Johanna?
I teach at Canisius College. It's a Jesuit college in upstate New York.
And as a Jesuit college, is it primarily left or is it more right?
It's right. Interestingly enough, despite the fact of its Catholic identity, we don't have very many conversations about politics. Very conservative. So it's been difficult to offer some other viewpoints and perspectives. The college is funded by privately, obviously, and so we're kind of censored. We have to be careful what we say. It might be anti-Catholic, it might be anti-right, but I find I'm not able to talk as freely at this university as I'm able to when I'm in Germany. So it's been an interesting experience.
I'm just wondering, have there been any left-wing speakers or such that have been tried to bring, and has there been a controversy over that? I'm sorry, this is
Yeah,
sort of the other
interesting.
side of what we're dealing with in ways.
I understand that. We had Hillary Clinton come. This was before she was running for the presidency, and with many protests, wouldn't even let her get through the door to the center where she was going to speak. It was quite embarrassing, actually. So yeah, very. We have to be careful what we say and who we bring to the campus. Lots of layers of, permission to do it. So it's been this a censorship that I'm not very used to. Growing up in Germany in the 1970s, I didn't see that, and I don't see it now. I'm in Germany often.
Yeah.
Political conversations are part of our everyday interactions with one another. So this has been difficult.
Yeah, and I think that's a good check for many of us who are at campuses that are more liberal, because it's important to remember that this is not just a kind of liberal, shutting down of conservative discourse. There's also a conservative shutting down of liberal discourse, and that's an important
It's
part of it.
complicated by the religious affiliation of the college, and I do realize that. But nonetheless, it's an institution of higher learning, one would think, and that we need more representation of various voices. So that's that pushback to be careful and to stay in step with what the college is saying.
Yeah. Good. Thank you. I'm going to just move on. Susan writes, in Charlottesville, it seems that only the angry are seen as part of the struggle. And I think that's actually an important insight that, I forget, someone wrote a piece recently, and I think it was in the Times or somewhere, where they said, it was in the Journal. Someone wrote it, I forget who, but like this whole thing is sort of ridiculous. The small number of neo-Nazis in the country, which are tiny, and the small numbers of Antifa, which are tiny, she said, let them go and do them, and we just ignore them. Would it make a lot, make it a lot more easy? I think there is a lot of that we sometimes think that only the angry people are part of the struggle because they speak the loudest and dominate the oxygen. And there's really no way to stop that, but it does seem to be the case. And, to pull it back to Arendt, right, this idea of having a equal public space where everyone can speak and act is really her ideal. And what we're seeing right now is that over the country, in different places, different groups are feeling disenfranchised and invisible. And I think it's not just left-right. That's way too simple. In some places, I think minorities are feeling disenfranchised. In some cases, white people, in all sorts of complicated ways, are feeling disenfranchised. In some people, men. In some people, women. Some places, Jews. In some places, Christians. I mean, I think I've mentioned this before, but a number of African Americans in Bard have told me that they feel more invisible as Christians than they do as African Americans at the college, because as African Americans they sort of have a currency, whereas Christians it's considered to be really an embarrassing or negative idea. Mukaya writes, with Turkey's coup attempt and the government purges of academics, there has been a tremendous amount of anxiety and censorship in Turkish academia. It's tragically scary and dreadful. But Turkey's a different thing. I mean, in Turkey, you don't have just a kind of social idea, a social repression that is sometimes conservative and sometimes liberal and sometimes black and sometimes white, sometimes Muslim and sometimes Christian. You have, I don't know what, we'd have to look more closely whether it's totalitarian or proto-fascist, but you have a tyrannical regime. I don't think there's any other way to put it in Turkey. At least a tyrannical regime, potentially more than that. And that's a real attack on freedom that is deeply disturbing and meaningful. We talked a fair bit about that, I think, when we were reading on the origins of totalitarianism. Suzanne writes, in no small part due to our reading, I have become involved in local politics in our small northern Dutchess County town. That makes me really happy, Suzanne, let me just say. I feel involved in a social experiment. We have a slate of Democratic candidates, but all but one candidate began the process as independent or no party. We're trying to highlight our diversity and compromise. It's a good thing, I think, but will it win an election? Wow. I mean, Suzanne, that's, that really warms my heart. To me, this is what needs to happen. When Bob and I talk about the potential regeneration of the country or the regeneration of an American idea, that's what has to happen. That's why I keep talking about the Tea Party, not because I agree with everything they say, but because I think they're trying to do that. And I think the people on all sides need to do it. We need to get back into the American spirit of engaging. So, I don't know if you're coming to the conference in October on Crises of Democracy, Suzanne, but one of our main speakers is Michael White. And he was one of the founders of Occupy Wall Street, or originators of Occupy Wall Street. He's the one who designed the poster with the bull and the ballerina, that iconic poster. And, after Occupy Wall Street ended, he sort of became very disillusioned with it and wrote a book against protest, saying that we need to stop protesting and get involved in politics. And he's lately come to the opinion that the best way to get involved in politics is to move to a small town and run for mayor or get involved in local politics. And he has done that. He's moved to he's black, and he's moved to a small town in Oregon, which is mostly white, and ran for mayor. Now, he didn't win, but he got 38% of the vote, and that's not nothing. So he's going to be speaking at the conference about that idea, and I wish you luck. And to me, that's the best way that people today can begin to make a difference. Because even if you're ideological, if you run for office and you engage in politics, you're going to have to compromise. You're going to have to speak to people beyond your comfort zone. And that discipline of doing that will, I think, is what will save us from these ideological silos. Bob writes, here's my... Go ahead.
This is Suzanne. I'll just thank you to all of you for the support, and I'll keep you all posted on how it goes. We'll see. Thank you.
Great. Bob writes, my ticket for 2020, Obama runs again with Lindsey Graham as his running mate. All the power to you, Bob. I have no idea. We need something, so I'm open to all ideas. Daphne writes, this is new in the USA, but the silencing of ideological opposition has long been prevalent in other countries. Yes, proving how free we have been in this part of the world until the recent distortion of decency in the public arena. I think that's an excellent point, and let me just say the key word there is decency. I mean, of all the other things Donald Trump is, and there's a lot we can say about him, his indecency is sort of, I think, part of the most damaging part of his personality as a politician, and it really is leading towards a much more hate-filled public discourse than we've ever experienced, or not ever experienced. That's ridiculous. Certainly lately experienced. You know, if you're an optimist, and I sometimes try to be, some of this may need to get out. You need, in a way, part of the reason there's so little confidence in the establishment is that people feel it's dishonest, that it's saying one thing, that it's saying something that it doesn't believe. I think this is a lot of the critique of political correctness, and that, if we can somehow use this opportunity, this horrific opportunity, to begin a more honest conversation about some of these issues, I think that will be a good thing. That's a big if, and it's hard to do so in a climate in which anytime anyone says anything, they get called out by Trump or someone else on the internet, and that's why the indecency is so disturbing to me. Harold writes, curious if Johanna's college would allow the Pope to speak. Johanna?
I suspect it would probably welcome the Pope, but only on the basis that he's a Jesuit himself and Catholic. So it's a question I'm not sure I can answer.
Yeah, we should invite him. About Johanna's college, again, Suzanne writes, I am surprised to hear that this is happening in a Jesuit college. Among Catholic colleges, Jesuit institutions have often included more liberal, indeed liberating elements.
I want to second that. I want to plug my alma mater, Fordham University, where numerous students and faculty are involved in the good fight. Jesuit school.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And a lot of the Catholic and Jesuit schools are interesting today because they're some of the last places that still hold on to an idea of Western culture in the sort of curriculum, for better or worse. But they are at least a pluralizing element in the increasingly homogenous educational sphere. Johanna writes, it was quite liberal 15 years ago when I first came there, but not sure why this wave of conservatism has evolved. And then Bob's trying to say something. Johanna. Any final comments? Because we're just at the end of our session. Any questions about the text? Were there any lines or paragraphs that people wanted to actually return to? We have a couple minutes.
Well, I did think one insight that I got, and I really take exception that they didn't solve the slavery problem or another problem, is that they were making it up as they were going along. I took that out of her text. Namely, they didn't realize where it was all going at the beginning. That's why she cites John Adams so often. We're inventing it. He's saying over and over, we're inventing this thing and we don't know where it's going. And that's, so I took that as a reason why many problems weren't solved. And here we are 200 years later and we haven't solved it either. So we can't take it out on the founding fathers.
Yeah. Anyone want to comment on that? I mean, I think it is right, and I think it's also important to realize that, what she's saying is she's relying very much on the writings of European visitors to the U.S. I mean, Tocqueville was one of them, but others as well, if you look at her footnotes. And what she's saying is, they were all amazed that there was no misery in the country. And she's like, how could that happen? How could they all just ignore slavery? And, that's to her a problem. And yet it was a reality. The people just ignored it. Suzanne writes, you would have liked the musical Hamilton. I'm, probably would have liked the musical Hamilton, although there were a lot of historical changes to the musical that she may have objected to. I don't know. Well, very good. I think we meet. Dan, you can correct me if I'm wrong. I think and I'm sorry I was confused last week. We met now 2 weeks in a row, but I believe now we're on a bi-weekly schedule, every other week. So we will meet is that right?
Sorry, Raj. We are scheduled for next Friday.
We are.
Yes.
Okay, so we're meeting 3 Fridays in a row and then going on a bi-weekly schedule. So next Friday, we'll be doing the social question, which I know many of you, based on the questions we're already getting, are deeply interested in. It's probably one of the more controversial chapters she wrote after the Little Rock essay. It's long, and so I encourage you to make sure you give yourself time to read it. The video on it may end up being a little longer than the last 2 have been because it's a long and very involved chapter. I'll try and keep it short, but there's a lot to say in it. So I look forward to reading Arendt with you, and enjoy reading Arendt. We'll talk next week. Thanks very much.